Chapter 21 of The Road to Oz by L. Frank Baum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Dorothy Receives the Guests. Next morning, Dorothy's breakfast was served in her own pretty sitting room, and she sent to invite Polly and the Shaggy Man to join her and Button-Bright at the meal. They came gladly, and Toto also had breakfast with them, so that the little party that had traveled together to Oz was once more reunited. No sooner had they finished eating than they heard the distant blast of many trumpets and the sound of a brass band playing martial music, so they all went out upon the balcony. This was at the front of the palace and overlooked the streets of the city, being higher than the wall that shut in the palace grounds. They saw approaching down the street a band of musicians playing as hard and loud as they could, while the people of the Emerald City crowded the sidewalks and cheered so lustily that they almost drowned the noise of the drums and horns. Dorothy looked to see what they were cheering at, and discovered that behind the band was the famous Scarecrow, riding proudly upon the back of a wooden sawhorse, which pranced along the street almost as gracefully as if it had been made of flesh. Its hoofs, or rather the ends of its wooden legs, were shod with plates of solid gold, and the saddle strapped to the wooden body was richly embroidered and glistened with jewels. As he reached the palace, the Scarecrow looked up and saw Dorothy, and at once waved his peaked hat at her in greeting. He rode up to the front door and dismounted, and the band stopped playing and went away, and the crowds of people returned to their dwellings. By the time Dorothy and her friends had re-entered her room, the Scarecrow was there, and he gave the girl a hearty embrace and shook the hands of the others with his own squashy hands, which were white gloves filled with straw. The Shaggy Man, Button-Bright, and Polychrome stared hard at this celebrated person, who was acknowledged to be the most popular and most beloved man in all the Land of Oz. "Why, your face has been newly painted!" exclaimed Dorothy, when the first greetings were over. "I had it touched up a bit by the Munchkin farmer who first made me," answered the Scarecrow pleasantly. "My complexion had become a bit gray and faded, you know, and the paint had peeled off one end of my mouth, so I couldn't talk quite straight. Now I feel like myself again, and I may say, without immodesty, that my body is stuffed with the loveliest oat straw in all Oz." He pushed against his chest. "Hear me crunkle?" he asked. "Yes," said Dorothy, "you sound fine." Button-Bright was wonderfully attracted by the straw man, and so was Polly. The Shaggy Man treated him with great respect, because he was so queerly made. Jellia-Jam now came to say that Ozma wanted Princess Dorothy to receive the invited guests in the throne room as they arrived. The ruler was herself busy ordering the preparations for the morrow's festivities, so she wished her friend to act in her place. Dorothy willingly agreed, being the only other princess in the Emerald City, so she went to the great throne room and sat in Ozma's seat, placing Polly on one side of her and Button-Bright on the other. The Scarecrow stood at the left of the throne and the Tin Woodman at the right, while the wonderful Wizard and the Shaggy Man stood behind. The Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger came in, with bright new bows of ribbon on their collars and tails. After greeting Dorothy affectionately, the huge beasts lay down at the foot of the throne. While they waited, the Scarecrow, who was near the little boy, asked, "Why are you called Button-Bright?" "Don't know," was the answer. "Oh, yes, you do, dear," said Dorothy. "Tell the Scarecrow how you got your name." "Papa always said I was bright as a button, so Mama always called me Button-Bright," announced the boy. "Where is your Mama?" asked the Scarecrow. "Don't know," said Button-Bright. "Where is your home?" asked the Scarecrow. "Don't know," said Button-Bright. "Don't you want to find your Mama again?" asked the Scarecrow. "Don't know," said Button-Bright calmly. The Scarecrow looked thoughtful. "Your papa may have been right," he observed, "but there are many kinds of buttons, you see. There are silver and gold buttons, which are highly polished and glitter brightly. There are pearl and rubber buttons, and other kinds with surfaces more or less bright, but there is still another sort of button which is covered with dull cloth, and that must be the sort your papa meant when he said you were bright as a button. Don't you think so?" "Don't know," said Button Bright. Jack Pumpkinhead arrived, wearing a pair of new white kid gloves, and he brought a birthday present for Ozma, consisting of a necklace of pumpkin seeds. In each seed was set a sparkling carolite, which is considered the rarest and most beautiful gem that exists. The necklace was in a plush case, and Jellia Jamb put it on the table with the Princess Ozma's other presents. Next came a tall, beautiful woman, clothed in a splendid trailing gown, trimmed with exquisite lace as fine as cobweb. This was the important sorceress known as Glinda the Good, who had been of great assistance to both Ozma and Dorothy. There was no humbug about her magic, you may be sure, and Glinda was as kind as she was powerful. She greeted Dorothy most lovingly, and kissed Button-Bright and Polly, and smiled upon the Shaggy Man, after which Jellia Jamb led the sorceress to one of the most magnificent rooms of the royal palace and appointed 50 servants to wait upon her. The next arrival was Mr. H.M. Wogglebug, T.E., the H.M. meaning highly magnified and the T.E. meaning thoroughly educated. The Wogglebug was head professor at the Royal College of Oz, and he had composed a fine ode in honor of Ozma's birthday. This he wanted to read to them, but the Scarecrow wouldn't let him. Soon they heard a clucking sound and a chorus of cheep, cheep, and a servant threw open the door to allow Billina and her 10 fluffy chicks to enter the throne room. As the yellow hen marched proudly at the head of her family, Dorothy cried, "Oh, you lovely things!" and ran down from her seat to pet the little downy balls. Billina wore a pearl necklace, and around the neck of each chicken was a tiny gold chain holding a locket with the letter D engraved upon the outside. "Open the lockets, Dorothy," said Billina. The girl obeyed, and found a picture of herself in each locket. "They were named after you, my dear," continued the yellow hen, "so I wanted all my chickens to wear your picture. Clock, clock! Come here, Dorothy, this minute!" she cried, for the chickens were scattered and wandering all around the big room. They obeyed the call at once, and came running as fast as they could, fluttering their fluffy wings in a laughable way. It was lucky that Billina gathered the little ones under her soft breast just then, for Tik-Tok came in and tramped up to the throne on his flat copper feet. "I am all wound up and working finely," said the Clockwork Man to Dorothy. "I can hear him tick," declared Button-Bright. "You are quite the polished gentleman," said the Tin Woodman. "Stand up here beside the Shaggy Man, Tik-Tok, and help receive the company." Dorothy placed soft cushions in a corner for Billina and her chicks, and had just returned to the throne and seated herself when the playing of the royal band outside the palace announced the approach of distinguished guests. And my, how they did stare when the High Chamberlain threw open the doors and the visitors entered the throne room. First walked a gingerbread man, neatly formed and baked to a lovely brown tint. He wore a silk hat and carried a candy cane prettily striped with red and yellow. His shirt front and cuffs were white frosting, and the buttons on his coat were licorice drops. Behind the gingerbread man came a child with flaxen hair and merry blue eyes, dressed in white pajamas, with sandals on the soles of its pretty bare feet. The child looked around smiling, and thrust its hands into the pockets of the pajamas. Close after it came a big rubber bear, walking erect on its hind feet. The bear had twinkling black eyes, and its body looked as if it had been pumped full of air. Following these curious visitors were 2 tall, thin men and 2 short, fat men, all 4 dressed in gorgeous uniforms. Ozma's High Chamberlain now hurried forward to announce the names of the new arrivals, calling out in a loud voice: "His Gracious and Most Edible Majesty, King Dough the First,
ruler of the 2 kingdoms of Highland and Lowland, also the head bullywog of His Majesty, known as Chick the Cherub, and their faithful friend Para Bruin the Rubber Bear."
These great personages bowed low as their names were called, and Dorothy hastened to introduce them to the assembled company. They were the first foreign arrivals, and the friends of Princess Ozma were polite to them and tried to make them feel that they were welcome. Chick the Cherub shook hands with everyone, including Billina, and was so joyous and frank and full of good spirits that John Dough's head bullywog at once became a prime favorite. "Is it a boy or a girl?" whispered Dorothy. "Don't know," said Button-Bright.
"Goodness me, what a queer lot of people you are!" exclaimed the Rubber Bear, looking at the assembled company.
"So are you," said Button-Bright gravely. "Is King Dough good to eat?" "He's too good to eat," laughed Chick the Cherub.
"I hope none of you are fond of gingerbread," said the King rather anxiously.
"We would never think of eating our visitors if we were," declared the Scarecrow, "so please do not worry, for you will be perfectly safe while you remain in Oz." "Why do they call you Chick?" the Yellow Hen asked the child. "Because I'm an incubator baby, and never had any parents," replied the head bullywag. "My chicks have a parent, and I'm it," said Billina. "I'm glad of that," answered the Cherub, "because they'll have more fun worrying you than if they were brought up in an incubator. The incubator never worries, you know." King John Dough had brought for Ozma's birthday present a lovely gingerbread crown, with rows of small pearls around it, and a fine big pearl in each of its 5 points. After this had been received by Dorothy with proper thanks and placed on the table with the other presents, the visitors from Highland and Lowland were escorted to their rooms by the High Chamberlain. They had no sooner departed than the band before the palace began to play again, announcing more arrivals, and as these were doubtless from foreign parts, the High Chamberlain hurried back to receive them in his most official manner. End of chapter 21. The Road to Oz by L. Frank Baum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Important Arrivals. First entered a band of Ryls from the Happy Valley, all merry little sprites like fairy elves. A dozen crooked Knooks followed from the great forest of Burzee. They had long whiskers and pointed caps and curling toes, yet were no taller than Button-Bright's shoulder. With this group came a man so easy to recognize and so important and dearly beloved throughout the known world that all present rose to their feet and bowed their heads in respectful homage, even before the High Chamberlain knelt to announce his name.
"The most mighty and loyal friend of children, His Supreme Highness Santa Claus," said the Chamberlain in an awed voice. "Well, well, well! Glad to see you, glad to meet you all!" cried Santa Claus briskly, as he trotted up the long room. He was round as an apple, with a fresh rosy face, laughing eyes, and a bushy beard as white as snow. A red cloak trimmed with beautiful ermine hung from his shoulders, and upon his back was a basket filled with pretty presents for the Princess Ozma. "Hello, Dorothy. Still having adventures?"
he asked in his jolly way, as he took the girl's hand in both his own. "How did you know my name, Santa?" she replied, feeling more shy in the presence of this immortal saint than she ever had before in her young life.
"Why, don't I see you every Christmas Eve when you're asleep?"
he rejoined, pinching her blushing cheek. "Oh, do you?"
"And here's Button-Bright, I declare!" cried Santa Claus, holding up the boy to kiss him. "What a long way from home you are, dear me!"
"Do you know Button-Bright, too?" questioned Dorothy eagerly.
"Indeed I do. I visited his home several Christmas Eves."
"And do you know his father?" asked the girl.
"Certainly, my dear. Who else do you suppose brings him his Christmas neckties and stockings?" with a sly wink at the Wizard.
"Then where does he live? We're just crazy to know, 'cause Button Bright's lost," she said.
Santa laughed and laid his finger aside of his nose, as if thinking what to reply. He leaned over and whispered something in the Wizard's ear, at which the Wizard smiled and nodded as if he understood. Now Santa Claus spied Polychrome and trotted over to where she stood. "Seems to me the Rainbow's Daughter is farther from home than any of you," he observed, looking at the pretty maiden admiringly. "I'll have to tell your father where you are, Polly, and send him to get you."
"Please do, dear Santa Claus," implored the little maid beseechingly.
"But just now we must all have a jolly good time at Ozma's party," said the old gentleman, turning to put his presents on the table with the others already there. "It isn't often I find time to leave my castle, as you know, but Ozma invited me and I just couldn't help coming to celebrate the happy occasion."
"I'm so glad!" exclaimed Dorothy.
"These are my Ryls,"
pointing to the little sprites squatting around him.
"Their business is to paint the colors of the flowers when they bud and bloom, but I brought the merry fellows along to see Oz, and they've left their paint pots behind them. Also I brought these crooked Knooks, whom I love. My dears, the Knooks are much nicer than they look, for their duty is to water and care for the young trees of the forest, and they do their work faithfully and well. It's hard work, though, and it makes my Knooks crooked and gnarled, like the trees themselves. But their hearts are big and kind, as are the hearts of all who do good in our beautiful world."
"I've read of the Ryls and Knooks," said Dorothy, looking upon these little workers with interest. Santa Claus turned to talk with the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman, and he also said a kind word to the Shaggy Man, and afterward went away to ride the Sawhorse around the Emerald City. "For," said he, "I must see all the grand sights while I am here and have the chance. And Ozma has promised to let me ride the Sawhorse, because I'm getting fat and short of breath." "Where are your reindeer?" asked Polychrome.
"I left them at home, for it is too warm for them in this sunny country," he answered. "They're used to winter weather when they travel."
In a flash he was gone, and the Ryls and Knooks with him, but they could all hear the golden hoofs of the Sawhorse ringing on the marble pavement outside as he pranced away with his noble rider. Presently the band played again, and the High Chamberlain announced, "Her Gracious Majesty, the Queen of Merryland." They looked earnestly to discover whom this queen might be, and saw advancing up the room an exquisite wax doll dressed in dainty fluffs and ruffles and spangled gown. She was almost as big as Button Bright, and her cheeks and mouth and eyebrow were prettily painted in delicate colors. Her blue eyes stared a bit, being of glass, yet the expression upon her Majesty's face was quite pleasant and decidedly winning. With the Queen of Merryland were 4 wooden soldiers, 2 stalking ahead of her with much dignity, and 2 following behind, like a royal bodyguard. The soldiers were painted in bright colors and carried wooden guns, and after them came a fat little man who attracted attention at once, although he seemed modest and retiring, for he was made of candy and carried a tin sugar sifter filled with powdered sugar, with which he dusted himself frequently so that he wouldn't stick to things if he touched them. The High Chamberlain had called him the Candy Man of Merryland, and Dorothy saw that one of his thumbs looked as if it had been bitten off by someone who was fond of candy and couldn't resist the temptation. The Wax Doll Queen spoke prettily to Dorothy and the others, and sent her loving greetings to Ozma before she retired to the rooms prepared for her. She had brought a birthday present wrapped in tissue paper and tied with pink and blue ribbons, and one of the wooden soldiers placed it on the table with the other gifts. But the Candy Man did not go to his room, because he said he preferred to stay and talk with the Scarecrow and Tik Tok and the Wizard and Tin Woodman, whom he declared the queerest people he had ever seen. Button Bright was glad the Candy Man stayed in the throne room, because the boy thought this guest smelled deliciously of wintergreen and maple sugar. The Braided Man now entered the room, having been fortunate enough to receive an invitation to the Princess Ozma's party. He was from a cave halfway between the Invisible Valley and the country of the Gargoyles, and his hair and whiskers were so long that he was obliged to plait them into many braids that hung to his feet, and every braid was tied with a bow of colored ribbon. "I've brought Princess Ozma a box of flutters for her birthday," said the Braided Man earnestly, "and I hope she will like them, for they are the finest quality I have ever made." "I'm sure she will be greatly pleased," said Dorothy, who remembered the Braided Man well, and the Wizard introduced the guest to the rest of the company, and made him sit down in a chair and keep quiet, for if allowed he would talk continually about his flutters. The band then played a welcome to another set of guests, and into the throne room swept the handsome and stately Queen of Ev. Beside her was young King Evardo, and following them came the entire royal family of 5 princesses and 4 princes of Ev. The kingdom of Ev lay just across the Deadly Desert to the north of Oz, and once Ozma and her people had rescued the Queen of Ev and her 10 children from the Nome King, who had enslaved them. Dorothy had been present on this adventure, so she greeted the royal family cordially, and all the visitors were delighted to meet the little Kansas girl again. They knew Tik Tok and Billina, too, and the Scarecrow and Tin Woodman, as well as the Lion and Tiger, so there was a joyful reunion, as you may imagine, and it was fully an hour before the Queen and her train retired to their rooms. Perhaps they would not have gone then had not the band begun to play to announce new arrivals, but before they left the great throne room King Evardo added to Ozma's birthday presents a diadem of diamonds set in radium. The next comer proved to be King Renard of Foxville, or King Dox as he preferred to be called. He was magnificently dressed in a new feather costume, and wore white kid mittens over his paws, and a flower in his buttonhole, and had his hair parted in the middle. King Dox thanked Dorothy fervently for getting him the invitation to come to Oz, which he all his life had longed to visit. He strutted around rather absurdly as he was introduced to all the famous people assembled in the throne room, and when he learned that Dorothy was a Princess of Oz, the Fox King insisted on kneeling at her feet, and afterward retired backward, a dangerous thing to do, as he might have stubbed his paw and tumbled over. No sooner was he gone than the blasts of bugles and clatter of drums and cymbals announced important visitors, and the High Chamberlain assumed his most dignified tone as he threw open the door and said proudly: "Her Supreme and Resplendent Majesty, Queen Zix of Ix, His Serene and Tremendous Majesty, King Bud of Noland, Her Royal Highness the Princess Fluff." That 3 such high and mighty royal personages should arrive at once was enough to make Dorothy and her companions grow solemn and assume their best company manners. But when the exquisite beauty of Queen Zix met their eyes, they thought they had never beheld anything so charming. Dorothy decided that Zix must be about 16 years old, but the Wizard whispered to her that this wonderful queen had lived thousands of years, but knew the secret of remaining always fresh and beautiful. King Bud of Noland and his dainty fair-haired sister, the Princess Fluff, were friends of Zix, as their kingdoms were adjoining, So they had traveled together from their far-off domains to do honor to Ozma of Oz on the occasion of her birthday. They brought many splendid gifts, so the table was now fairly loaded down with presents. Dorothy and Polly loved the Princess Fluff the moment they saw her, and little King Bud was so frank and boyish that Button-Bright accepted him as a chum at once, and did not want him to go away. But it was afternoon now, and the royal guests must prepare their toilets for the grand banquet at which they were to assemble that evening to meet the reigning princess of this fairyland. So Queen Zix was shown to her room by a troop of maidens led by Jellia Jamb, and Bud and Fluff presently withdrew to their own apartments. "My, what a big party Ozma is going to have!" exclaimed Dorothy. "I guess the palace will be chock full, Button-Bright, don't you think so?" "Don't know," said the boy. "But we must go to our rooms pretty soon, to dress for the banquet," continued the girl. "I don't have to dress," said the Candy Man from Merryland. "All I need to do is dust myself with fresh sugar." "Tik-Tok always wears the same suits of clothes," said the Tin Woodman, "and so does our friend the Scarecrow." "My feathers are good enough for any occasion," cried Billina from her corner. "Then I shall leave you four to welcome any new guests that come," said Dorothy, "for Button-Bright and I must look our very best at Ozma's banquet." "Who is still to come?" asked the Scarecrow. "Well, there's King Kik-a-bray of Dunkington, and Johnny Dooit, and the Good Witch of the North. But Johnny Dooit may not get here until late, he's so very busy." "We will receive them and give them a proper welcome," promised the Scarecrow. "So run along, little Dorothy, and get yourself dressed." End of chapter 22. Three of the Road to Oz by L. Frank Baum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. The Grand Banquet. I wish I could tell you how fine the company was that assembled that evening at Ozma's royal banquet. A long table was spread in the center of the great dining hall of the palace, and the splendor of the decorations and the blaze of lights and jewels was acknowledged to be the most magnificent sight that any of the guests had ever seen. The jolliest person present, as well as the most important, was, of course, old Santa Claus. So he was given the seat of honor at one end of the table, while at the other end sat Princess Ozma, the hostess. John Dough, Queen Zix, King Bud, the Queen of Ev, and her son Evardo, and the Queen of Merryland had golden thrones to sit in, while the others were supplied with beautiful chairs. At the upper end of the banquet room was a separate table provided for the animals. Toto sat at one end of this table with a bib tied around his neck and a silver platter to eat from. At the other end was placed a small stand with a low rail around the edge of it for Billina and her chicks. The rail kept the 10 little Dorothys from falling off the stand, while the yellow hen could easily reach over and take her food from any tray upon the table. At the other places sat the Hungry Tiger, the Cowardly Lion, the Sawhorse, the Rubber Bear, the Fox King, and the Donkey King. They made quite a company of animals. At the lower end of the great room was another table, at which sat the Ryls and Knooks who had come with Santa Claus, the wooden soldiers who had come with the Queen of Merryland, and the Highlanders and Lowlanders who had come with John Dough. Here were also seated the officers of the royal palace and of Ozma's army. The splendid costumes of those at the three tables made a gorgeous and glittering display that no one present was ever likely to forget. Perhaps there has never been in any part of the world at any time another assemblage of such wonderful people as that which gathered this evening to honor the birthday of the ruler of Oz. When all members of the company were in their places, an orchestra of 500 pieces, in a balcony overlooking the banquet room, began to play sweet and delightful music. Then a door draped with royal green opened, and in came the fair and girlish Princess Ozma, who now greeted her guests in person for the first time. As she stood by her throne at the head of the banquet table, every eye was turned eagerly upon the lovely princess, who was as dignified as she was bewitching, and who smiled upon all her old and new friends in a way that touched their hearts and brought an answering smile to every face. Each guest had been served with a crystal goblet filled with lacasa, which is a sort of nectar famous in Oz, and nicer to drink than soda water or lemonade. Santa now made a pretty speech in verse, congratulating Ozma on having a birthday, and asking everyone present to drink to the health and happiness of their dearly beloved hostess. This was done with great enthusiasm by those who were made so they could drink at all, and those who could not drink politely touched the rims of their goblets to their lips. All seated themselves at the tables, and the servants of the princess began serving the feast. I'm quite sure that only in Fairyland could such a delicious repast be prepared. The dishes were of precious metals set with brilliant jewels, and the good things to eat which were placed upon them were countless in number and of exquisite flavor. Several present, such as the Candy Man, the Rubber Bear, Tik-Tok, and the Scarecrow, were not made so they could eat, and the Queen of Merryland contented herself with a small dish of sawdust. But these enjoyed the pomp and glitter of the gorgeous scene as much as did those who feasted. The Woggle-Bug read his Ode to Ozma, which was written in very good rhythm, and was well received by the company. The Wizard added to the entertainment by making a big pie appear before Dorothy, and when the little girl cut the pie, the 9 tiny piglets leaped out of it and danced around the table, while the orchestra played a merry tune. This amused the company very much, but they were even more pleased when Polychrome, whose hunger had been easily satisfied, rose from the table and performed her graceful and bewildering rainbow dance for them. When it was ended, the people clapped their hands and the animals clapped their paws, while Billina cackled and the Donkey King brayed approval. Johnny Dooit was present, and of course he proved he could do wonders in the way of eating, as well as in everything else that he undertook to do. The Tin Woodman sang a love song, everyone joining in the chorus, and the wooden soldiers from Merryland gave an exhibition of a lightning drill with their wooden muskets. The Ryls and Knooks danced the fairy circle, and the Rubber Bear bounced himself all around the room. There was laughter and merriment on every side, and everybody was having a royal good time. Button-Bright was so excited and interested that he paid little attention to his fine dinner and a great deal of attention to his queer companions, and perhaps he was wise to do this, because he could eat at any other time. The feasting and merrymaking continued until late in the evening, when they separated to meet again the next morning and take part in the birthday celebration, to which this royal banquet was merely the introduction. End of chapter 23. Four of The Road to Oz by L. Frank Baum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. The Birthday Celebration. A clear, perfect day, with a gentle breeze and a sunny sky, greeted Princess Ozma as she wakened next morning, the anniversary of her birth. While it was yet early, all the city was astir, and crowds of people came from all parts of the Land of Oz to witness the festivities in honor of their girl ruler's birthday. The noted visitors from foreign countries, who had all been transported to the Emerald City by means of the Magic Belt, were as much a show to the Ozites as were their own familiar celebrities, and the streets leading from the royal palace to the jeweled gates were thronged with men, women, and children to see the procession as it passed out to the green fields where the ceremonies were to take place. And what a great procession it was! First came 1,000 young girls, the prettiest in the land, dressed in white muslin, with green sashes and hair ribbons, bearing green baskets of red roses. As they walked, they scattered these flowers upon the marble pavements, so that the way was carpeted thick with roses for the procession to walk upon. Then came the rulers of the 4 kingdoms of Oz, the Emperor of the Winkies, the monarch of the Munchkins, the king of the Quadlings, and the sovereign of the Gillikins, each wearing a long chain of emeralds around his neck to show that he was a vassal of the ruler of the Emerald City. Next marched the Emerald City Cornet Band, clothed in green and gold uniforms and playing the Ozma two-step. The Royal Army of Oz followed, consisting of 27 officers, from the Captain General down to the lieutenants. There were no privates in Ozma's army, because soldiers were not needed to fight battles, but only to look important, and an officer always looks more imposing than a private. While the people cheered and waved their hats and handkerchiefs, there came walking the royal Princess Ozma, looking so pretty and sweet that it is no wonder her people love her so dearly. She had decided she would not ride in her chariot that day, as she preferred to walk in the procession with her favorite subjects and her guests. Just in front of her trotted the living blue bear rug owned by old Dinah, which wobbled clumsily on its 4 feet, because there was nothing but the skin to support them, with a stuffed head at one end and a stubby tail at the other. But whenever Ozma paused in her walk, the bear rug would flop down flat upon the ground for the Princess to stand upon until she resumed her progress. Following the Princess stalked her 2 enormous beasts, the Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger, and even if the army had not been there, these 2 would have been powerful enough to guard their mistress from any harm. Next marched the invited guests, who were loudly cheered by the people of Oz along the road, and were therefore obliged to bow to right and left almost every step of the way. First was Santa Claus, who, because he was fat and not used to walking, rode the wonderful Sawhorse. The merry old gentleman had a basket of small toys with him, and he tossed the toys one by one to the children as he passed by. His Ryls and Canucks marched close behind him. Queen Zix of Zix came after, then John Doe and the Cherub, with the rubber bear named Para Bruin strutting between them on its hind legs, then the Queen of Merryland, escorted by her wooden soldiers, then King Bud of Noland and his sister, the Princess Fluff, then the Queen of Ev and her 10 royal children, then the Braided Man and the Candy Man side by side, then King Dox of Foxville and King Kickabrey of Dunkyton, who by this time had become good friends, and finally Johnny Dooit in his leather apron, smoking his long pipe. These wonderful personages were not more heartily cheered by the people than were those who followed after them in the procession. Dorothy was a general favorite, and she walked arm in arm with the Scarecrow, who was beloved by all. Then came Polychrome and Button-Bright, and the people loved the Rainbow's pretty daughter and the beautiful blue-eyed boy as soon as they saw them. The Shaggy Man, in his shaggy new suit, attracted much attention because he was such a novelty. With regular steps tramped the Machine Man, Tick-Tock, and there was more cheering when the Wizard of Oz followed in the procession. The Woggle-Bug and Jack Pumpkinhead were next, and behind them Glinda the Sorceress and the Good Witch of the North. Finally came Billina, with her brood of chickens, to whom she clucked anxiously to keep them together and to hasten them along so they would not delay the procession. Another band followed, this time the Tin Band of the Emperor of the Winkies, playing a beautiful march called "There's No Plate Like Tin." Then came the servants of the royal palace in a long line, and behind them all the people joined the procession and marched away through the emerald gates and out upon the broad green. Here had been erected a splendid pavilion, with a grand stand big enough to seat all the royal party and those who had taken part in the procession. Over the pavilion, which was of green silk and cloth of gold, countless banners waved in the breeze. Just in front of this, and connected with it by a runway had been built a broad platform, so that all the spectators could see plainly the entertainment provided for them. The Wizard now became master of ceremonies, as Ozma had placed the conduct of the performance in his hands. After the people had all congregated about the platform, and the royal party and the visitors were seated in the grandstand, the Wizard skillfully performed some feats of juggling glass balls and lighted candles. He tossed a dozen or so of them high in the air, and caught them one by one as they came down without missing any. Then he introduced a scarecrow, who did a sword-swallowing act that aroused much interest. After this, the Tin Woodman gave an exhibition of swinging the axe, which he made to whirl around him so rapidly that the eye could scarcely follow the motion of the gleaming blade. Glinda, the sorceress, then stepped upon the platform, and by her magic made a big tree grow in the middle of the space, made blossoms appear upon the tree, and made the blossoms become delicious fruit called tamornas. And so great was the quantity of fruit produced that when the servants climbed the tree and tossed it down to the crowd, there was enough to satisfy every person present. Para Bruin, the rubber bear, climbed to a limb of the big tree, rolled himself into a ball, and dropped to the platform, whence he bounded up again to the limb. He repeated this bouncing act several times, to the great delight of all the children present. After he had finished and bowed and returned to his seat, Glinda waved her wand and the tree disappeared, but its fruit still remained to be eaten. The Good Witch of the North amused the people by transforming 10 stones into 10 birds, the 10 birds into 10 lambs, and the 10 lambs into 10 little girls, who gave a pretty dance, and were then transformed into 10 stones again, just as they were in the beginning. Johnny Dooit next came to the platform with his tool chest, and in a few minutes built a great flying machine, then put his chest in the machine, and the whole thing flew away together, Johnny and all, after he had bid good-bye to those present and thanked the Princess for her hospitality. The Wizard then announced the last act of all, which was considered really wonderful. He had invented a machine to blow huge soap bubbles as big as balloons, and this machine was hidden under the platform, so that only the rim of the big clay pipe to produce the bubbles showed above the flooring. The tank of soapsuds and the air pumps to inflate the bubbles were out of sight beneath, so that when the bubbles began to grow upon the floor of the platform, it really seemed like magic to the people of Oz, who knew nothing about even the common soap bubbles that our children blow from a penny clay pipe and a basin of soap and water. The Wizard had invented another thing. Usually soap bubbles are frail and burst easily, lasting only a few moments as they float in the air. But the Wizard added a sort of glue to his soapsuds, which made his bubbles tough, and as the glue dried rapidly when exposed to the air, the Wizard's bubbles were strong enough to float for hours without breaking. He began by blowing, by means of his machinery and air pumps, several large bubbles, which he allowed to float upward into the sky, where the sunshine fell upon them and gave them iridescent hues that were most beautiful. This aroused much wonder and delight, because it was a new amusement to every one present, except perhaps Dorothy and Button-Bright, and even they had never seen such big, strong bubbles before. The Wizard then blew a bunch of small bubbles, and afterward blew a big bubble around them, so they were left in the center of it. Then he allowed the whole mass of pretty globes to float into the air and disappear in the far distant sky.
"This is really fine,"
declared Santa Claus, who loved toys and pretty things.
"I think, Mr. Wizard, I shall have you blow a bubble around me. Then I can float away home and see the country spread out beneath me as I travel. There isn't a spot on earth that I haven't visited, but I usually go in the night time, riding behind my swift reindeer. Here's a good chance to observe the country by daylight, while I am riding slowly and at my ease."
"Do you think you will be able to guide the bubble?" asked the Wizard.
"Oh, yes, I know enough magic to do that," replied Santa Claus. "You'll blow the bubble with me inside of it, and I'll be sure to get home in safety."
"Please send me home in a bubble, too," begged the Queen of Merryland.
"Very well, madam, you shall try the journey first," politely answered old Santa.
The pretty wax doll bade good-bye to the Princess Ozma and the others, and stood on the platform while the Wizard blew a big soap bubble around her. When completed, he allowed the bubble to float slowly upward, and there could be seen the little Queen of Merryland standing in the middle of it and blowing kisses from her fingers to those below. The bubble took a southerly direction, quickly floating out of sight. "That's a very nice way to travel," said Princess Fluff. "I'd like to go home in a bubble, too." So the Wizard blew a big bubble around Princess Fluff, and another around King Bud, her brother, and a third one around Queen Zix. And soon these 3 bubbles had mounted into the sky and were floating off in a group in the direction of the Kingdom of Noland. The success of these ventures induced the other guests from foreign lands to undertake bubble journeys also. So the Wizard put them one by one inside his bubbles, and Santa Claus directed the way they should go, because he knew exactly where everybody lived. Finally Button-Bright said, "I want to go home, too."
"Why, so you shall," cried Santa, "for I'm sure your father and mother will be glad to see you again. Mr. Wizard, please blow a big fine bubble for Button-Bright to ride in, and I'll agree to send him home to his family as safe can be."
"I'm sorry," said Dorothy with a sigh, for she was fond of her little comrade, "but perhaps it's best for Button-Bright to get home, 'cause his folks must be worrying just dreadful." She kissed the boy, and Ozma kissed him too, and all the others waved their hands and said good-bye and wished him a pleasant journey. "Are you glad to leave us, dear?" asked Dorothy, a little wistfully. "Don't know," said Button-Bright. He sat down, cross-legged on the platform, with his sailor hat tipped back on his head, and the Wizard blew a beautiful bubble all around him. A minute later it had mounted into the sky, sailing toward the west, and the last they saw of Button-Bright he was still sitting in the middle of the shining globe and waving his sailor hat at those below. "Will you ride in a bubble, or shall I send you and Toto home by means of the magic belt?" the Princess asked Dorothy. "Guess I'll use the belt," replied the little girl. "I'm sort of 'fraid of those bubbles." "Ruff!" said Toto approvingly. He loved to bark at the bubbles as they sailed away, but he didn't care to ride in one. Santa Claus decided to go next. He thanked Ozma for her hospitality and wished her many happy returns of the day. Then the Wizard blew a bubble around his chubby little body, and smaller bubbles around each of his Ryls and Knooks. As the kind and generous friend of children mounted into the air, the people all cheered at the top of their voices, for they loved Santa Claus dearly, and the little man heard them through the walls of his bubble and waved his hands in return as he smiled down upon them. The band played bravely while everyone watched the bubble until it was completely out of sight. "How about you, Polly?" Dorothy asked her friend. "Are you 'fraid of bubbles, too?" "No," answered Polychrome, smiling, "but Santa Claus promised to speak to my father as he passed through the sky, so perhaps I shall get home an easier way." Indeed, the little maid had scarcely made this speech when a sudden radiance filled the air, and while the people looked on in wonder, the end of a gorgeous rainbow slowly settled down upon the platform. With a glad cry the Rainbow's Daughter sprang from her seat and danced along the curve of the bow, mounting gradually upward, while the folds of her gauzy gown whirled and floated around her like a cloud, and blended with the colors of the rainbow itself. "Goodbye, Ozma! Goodbye, Dorothy!" cried a voice they knew belonged to Polychrome, but now the little maiden's form had melted wholly into the rainbow, and their eyes could no longer see her. Suddenly the end of the rainbow lifted, and its colors slowly faded like mist before a breeze. Dorothy sighed deeply and turned to Ozma. "I'm sorry to lose Polly," she said, "but I guess she's better off with her father, 'cause even the Land of Oz couldn't be like home to a Cloud Fairy." "No, indeed," replied the Princess; "but it has been delightful for us to know Polychrome for a little while, and who knows? Perhaps we may meet the Rainbow's Daughter again some day." The entertainment now being ended, all left the pavilion and formed their gay procession back to the Emerald City again. Of Dorothy's recent traveling companions, only Toto and the Shaggy Man remained, and Ozma had decided to allow the latter to live in Oz for a time at least. If he proved honest and true, she promised to let him live there always, and the Shaggy Man was anxious to earn this reward. They had a nice quiet dinner together, and passed a pleasant evening with the Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, Tik-Tok, and the Yellow Hen for company. When Dorothy bade them good night, she kissed them all good bye at the same time, for Ozma had agreed that while Dorothy slept she and Toto should be transported by means of the magic belt to her own little bed in the Kansas farmhouse, and the little girl laughed as she thought how astonished Uncle Henry and Aunt Em would be when she came down to breakfast with them next morning. Quite content to have had so pleasant an adventure, and a little tired by all the day's busy scenes, Dorothy clasped Toto in her arms and lay down upon the pretty white bed in her room in Ozma's royal palace. Presently she was sound asleep. End of Chapter 24. End of The Road to Oz by L. Frank Baum. Recording by Phil Chenevert, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, May 2012.